Ladies and gentlemen, the next session is about to start. Please take your seat. Please take your seat.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming. Last January, Italy launched the Mattei Plan, a new way of working with Africa with a non-predatory approach. The plan seeks to address, from an African perspective, the root causes of instability and to foster growth in African countries. It's also a plan to have more control of migration from this continent to Europe. To this end, Italy and its African partners are jointly developing projects across key sectors, namely health, education, agriculture, water, energy, and infrastructure. We are here today to discuss about how the plan evolves since it was launched, or how Italy will manage to align its needs with those of its African partners, and also how to reinforce this plan with the system mechanism, financial mechanisms. Let me introduce you our speaker in this session. We have with us Edmondo Cirielli, Italian Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. Buonasera.
Buonasera.
Mohamed Ali Adahat, Chairman of the Libyan Foreign Bank. Salam alaikum.
Alaikum salam.
And Álvaro Lario, President of the International Fund for Agricultural Development. Buenas tardes. And I'm María Martín, journalist for Spanish newspaper El País. It is obvious that the Mattei Plan appeals to all of us in Europe to review our relations with Africa and invite us to think about how cooperation and development between North and South can be renewed. Italy, in fact, is seeking to rethink international cooperation with African countries. Mr. Cirielli, how is the Mattei Plan making a difference?
Sì, allora innanzitutto volevo iniziare da alcune sue riflessioni.
First of all, I wanted to start from your reflections. I want to be quick. I want to say that the Mattei Plan is not caused and is not a response to migration. A better future, or through illegal channels that actually enrich criminal organizations in Africa that have become more and more strong and powerful, and they are actually undermining the balance of Africa. And we also know that many of the people who actually leave Africa suffer torture and they never make it to Europe. So the Mattei Plan, the idea of Giorgia Meloni, based on one of the founding fathers of Italy. Mattei was a man fighting for freedom, but he was also a manager. He was doing import-export with oil, and this man was the one saying that we had to leave something in Africa. We didn't only have to take from Africa, but we had to invest in development. What do we mean by investing in development? Means investing in infrastructures, healthcare, but also in human resources with training and education. And this is a model that Eni, that is the oil company of Italy, still carries out. But in the light of what is going on, that the West has given over 40% of the resources for the development of Africa with few results, Italy said, okay, we need to change model. There is something that doesn't work. So we need to change approach. As I said yesterday in a panel, Africa is not a poor continent. Africa is a very rich continent. Over 60% of the agricultural lands are in Africa, of the world are in Africa. 60% of hydrocarbons and the resources are there. Renewable energies are there. Over 50%, over 60% of all the materials that we may use for the industries are there. So we're talking about an extremely rich continent. And we also need to think of the average age, because there's so many young people living there and they are a resource. So it can be a great opportunity, but it can also be a great risk for the continent around it, which is the Gulf and Italy as well. Italy belonging to Europe, if you allow me to say, because Italy is the door to Europe, so Europe itself. So Giorgia Meloni, with the Mattei plan, has wanted to put at the core of the European agenda the continent of Africa, and at the core of the G7 agenda. And she has made it, she wanted to show that the money has to be invested differently. What's the Mattei plan? It seems easy, but the investments have to be agreed with African countries, and also the system of international organizations and the expertise has to work in this direction. We can think that we give money to international organizations and international organizations don't agree with the African countries and they don't know what to do with the money. Of course, Italy now is giving a great momentum to what we believe, to what we call bilateral and multilateral. So we decide together with our African partners what to do, and if we believe that an international organization can do better, so we use their help. We actually ask for help. And this is another part of the Mattei plan. We ask our public and private system to participate, investing money. So it's not just money, funds coming from the cooperation of the European Union, but even the private and public sector on the territory. And all this in close partnership with the African countries.
Poverty and food insecurity are on the rise. Some of 420 million people are living under the poverty line in Africa. Of these, many live in rural areas. What platforms can the international community leverage to ensure these people get the opportunities for growth and develop they need?
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for the invitation. For us, it's a pleasure to be here. I think there's a moment right now in the world where we need a strong leadership in terms of many of the challenges we have related to poverty, to hunger, to the conflicts ongoing. And I think any of the dialogues like the one today led by Italy are very important to try to get at least to have this opportunity of seeing what are the plans. As you have mentioned, I think the important part of any platforms, and there's a number of platforms out there, is that they deliver concrete results, that they are focused on an action plan, and that they're changing the lives of the people on the ground. That means Vice Minister was talking about forced migration. And I think that what we need to do and what IFAD does concretely is to try to provide opportunities of increasing the income, of leading decent livelihoods, of creating opportunities in rural areas, actually where most of the poverty is concentrated. 80% of the poverty is in these rural areas. And it's not only in Africa. I think what makes a difference about Africa is that the world population will probably peak around 9 billion in a couple of decades, and almost a third of the population will be in Africa. We are talking about an extremely young population, under 18, and we are seeing countries like Nigeria that will go from 200 million to 400 million, most of them under 18 years. of aid. So it's very important that we produce opportunities that are locally led by the people on the ground. That's why, for us, investments is what these countries need. They do not need more food aid. What they need is opportunities to develop themselves. And as I said, these platforms need to deliver concrete results. One of them is obviously the G7 Apulia Food Systems Initiative, the Matei Plan, which brings together what we believe is also important. It's not only about agriculture, it's about water, it's about food, it's about energy, how you bring all of these sectors together, because we could increase food production, but if you don't have the storage to have it, if you cannot access markets, if you cannot sell this food, then it does not matter whether you produce it. And there's a lot of opportunities, specifically in Africa. You have the new Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which can give opportunities to integrate the region in terms of agriculture and food security. But what I would say is that food security can also be a driver of jobs. It can be also a driver of growth. Indeed, the agricultural sector usually is the most effective sector in terms of leading and taking people out of poverty compared to other sectors, just because of the sheer number of jobs and the sheer number of people that are actually investing there. So we very much support, and we have had a number of initiatives that if we have time we can also discuss under the Matei Plan, but also the G7 Apulia Food Systems Initiative. Thank you.
Security is also a key element on this conversation. The Matei Plan stresses the important link between economic growth in African countries and regional stability. Africa has indeed a huge potential for economic growth. However, investors from the global north are hesitant. Why is happening this, Mr. Adarat? And how can you create a confident environment in this difficult context that we can see in several African countries?
Fiducia ai paesi africani, ai diversi paesi africani coinvolti. Grazie Maria, grazie ai colleghi che sono qui con me sul palco e a tutti gli organizzatori e ovviamente grazie per l'invito e buon pomeriggio a tutti. È un argomento complesso per molte ragioni. Le aspirazioni per un maggiore sviluppo.
A common denominator, everybody is striving for it. However, nobody's been able to master an efficient plan to balance between the needs and the aspirations and the opportunities that are there. And one of the main reasons, in my opinion, is there's a missing element and a missing factor that is not absent, but not necessarily as prevalent. And that factor is the prosperity and the quality of life of the regions and the people that are impacted directly on both ends of the spectrum. And this is probably one of the main reasons for a lot of these initiatives that fail. They may succeed initially, they have a good sprint and takeoff, but they're not able to sustain the success and the longevity of it because of a lot of the instability. Some of it is organic, you know, humans will always be humans, you will always have disagreements, but a lot of it is artificial. And it's artificial because of the linkage between these economic initiatives and a lot of the political strife and the proxy wars that we see and the instability. And some of it is driven by the desire or the competition over some of these resources. It's actually mentioned about, you know, the percentages of availability of resources in Africa. Africa is the location, or the second most important area or region when it comes to economic growth. The IMF numbers estimate this year the growth will be around 3.7%. Next year could exceed 4.2 up to 4.5%. The global growth numbers are far less than that. So this is definitely an area where everybody is focusing. However, it does not have to be a combative competition. I think there are opportunities for synergy, and there's enough success for many areas and many regions to benefit. And I think the unique situation with the Matei Plan and Italy's position is something that we would like to capitalize on, not only as a bank or a network of banks in Libya, but also as a gateway of 2,000 plus kilometers shoreline on the Mediterranean and fairly fertile grounds when it comes to opportunities from an infrastructure standpoint, where it comes to cargo, air, land, or sea, as well as a basin for distribution. So when you think about that, the Matei Plan.
Quindi quando pensiamo al piano Mattei ci focalizziamo su determinati servizi e infrastrutture, ma le infrastrutture al momento non ci sono e mi riferisco alle strade, agli aeroporti, alla rete ferroviaria. C'è davvero un grande ritardo. anche nel settore energetico, anche in quello agritico. Quindi la qualità del cibo che dovrebbe essere prodotto per poi dare un impatto e avere un impatto sulla vita e sulla qualità delle persone, la qualità della vita delle persone, non è ancora qualcosa di ottenibile. Quindi c'è sicuramente opportunità di investimento, un investimento che potrebbe andare a beneficio di molti, ma dobbiamo garantire un accesso e per questo servono le infrastrutture, i porti e quant'altro. Quando guardiamo alle opportunità, i numeri ci sono sicuramente. I numeri, noi come banca ovviamente amiamo i numeri e i numeri li possiamo garantire. Questo non è difficile, è qualcosa di facile da conseguire, ma come avete già citato voi, ci sono dei rischi, le persone sono esitanti, magari hanno timore ad investire e vorrebbero avere la sicurezza che l'investimento che andranno a fare sarà un investimento sostenibile e la rete di azioni e la rete di azioni dovrebbe garantire questo successo. Quindi noi abbiamo sicuramente le prassi, i regolamenti, noi come banca più di tanti altri abbiamo tantissimi regolamenti e ovviamente c'è una ragione per cui questi regolamenti esistono. Quindi noi da questo punto di vista ci riteniamo un valore per le autorità italiane, per l'organizzazione, per creare questo ponte, per creare qualche cosa che dia fiducia. Non stiamo ovviamente dicendo che saremo in grado di eliminare i motivi di preoccupazione, ma dobbiamo avere tutti la volontà di assumerci dei rischi calcolati ovviamente, ma è impossibile immaginare una situazione con rischi zero e quindi dobbiamo pensare in maniera molto pragmatica, dobbiamo immaginare quali saranno i frutti che potremo raccogliere, dobbiamo pensare alla qualità della vita delle comunità, quindi dobbiamo sicuramente migliorare la qualità della vita delle persone, dobbiamo ricostruire.
Put politics aside, just as communities dealing with each other, there's very little trust. Everybody thinks that, oh, they're coming here to take advantage of us, take our resources and run away and leave us with the waste and the environmental impact and all of, and unfortunately some of that is true. Historically, that has been the case. So you have to inject confidence to the people to know the scenario is different. And this is where the more you have stakeholders involved, especially on the private sector, and I say that because private sector doesn't like to lose money. So if it's not profitable, if it's not efficient, and if it's not going to deliver value to their bottom line, they're not going to do it. I think we should leverage that as an advantage and as a tool to combat some of the instability, some of the corruption, and some of the other negative factors that have unfortunately, aborted some of these other initiatives in the past. So I feel very strongly about this as an institution, as someone who is taking part in a transformation in Libya that is, it's slow, it's not as fast as we would love. However, it's something that is critical. It's a matter of survival for us, and these kind of agreements, with Italy being one of our biggest partners, if not our biggest partner in trade, it's critical that these kind of bridges are successful, are solid from a credibility standpoint, and are sustainable for the long term.
The Mattei Plan proposes to improve development and growth in African countries through actions overseas key sectors. Mr. Sirielli, how do you evaluate the progress made so far, and what do you think should be the next steps?
Sì, grazie. Innanzitutto mi scuso se dopo il mio intervento dovrò scappare.
I'm sorry if I have to leave because of an important political issue decided yesterday, so I will be brief. We are particularly satisfied by this first year of work. Of course, in 1 year, it was not possible to achieve great results, but the main objective of the Mattei Plan, which is a framework, a tool, while the first objectives have been reached, we were able to convince about the importance of the Mattei Plan, and now the European Union is fully convinced and embraces the plan at full with an important and significant finance. The same is true for the G7. We are fully committed in the railway corridor of Lobito in the Australian African from the port of Lobito. It will be an essential element for the connectivity in the southern area of Africa. The great Western partner have opted for Africa, have chosen Africa, and we have convinced the African country that they must be the protagonists. They have to make proposal and they have to take the responsibility. Of course, we are talking about a shared responsibility with Italy and with other partners. And we have convinced the international organization to reshape their approach, listening to the countries in the territory and collaborating directly with Italy and with the Italian system. Just to give you some example, we have focused on agriculture because agriculture gives a series of immediate answers. It gives an immediate economic benefit. We aim at food safety. 60% of the arable land is in Africa, and they could be used to feed the world. Africa cannot feed itself, so we have launched a huge sanification project with the Northern Africa. In Libya, for example, but we are also working in Egypt, in Algeria, Tunisia. In Tunisia, we launched a project to use waste rain. And we are focusing on food safety, job creation, skill formation. There are good proposals. We are focusing on education, which is a key element. And at the same time, there is this training, which triggers a chain of opportunities also for regular migration. At the same time, agriculture, and we are considering coffee or cocoa supply chain could be used also to fight climate change, because if we use crops that can have a huge impact to absorb carbon dioxide and for climate change, it will be essential. We are working to focus on biofuels in Kenya, a project financed by Cassa Depositi e Prestiti. We have launched important projects in Congo, Ethiopia, with the Italian partnership. And last thing, but not less important, everybody is worried about the African debt, but everybody's keep on helping Africa, forcing Africa to accumulate debts. It's a sort of loop. Italy intervened with donations, but our credits for the rotative funds through the Cassa Depositi e Prestiti are not zero interest loans. They are distributed over time so that our credit, our loan becomes a donation almost for 40%. So we have pointed at a shift in paradigm also from the financial point of view, and it's a key element. And I would like to conclude, we are supporting African banks also with the financing credits or donation to banks. We are trying to be present. Africa needs new entrepreneurs, young entrepreneurs. We are pointing at digitalizations, which represent a new frontier for good quality jobs and jobs that can give a special perspective among young people in particular.
Grazie, good work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Maybe you prefer to come closer. Cirieli mentioned how agriculture is a key sector of the Mattei Plan. So, Mr. Lario, how do you think Italy and the International Fund for Agricultural Development could partner more to promote the African transition?
Well, thank you. I think the Minister mentioned a number of important things related to job, to debt. First of all, I think over the last years, it's clear that food security has become more of a national security, especially in certain countries after the invasion of Ukraine. And that has also disrupted a lot of the global food value chain. So it's important that we are also discussing this type of topics at the G7, at the G20. This year, Italy, as well as Brazil, put food security, family farming at the core of many of the discussions, including also at the finance track. So I think it's important that it continues also for the next G7 and G20 discussions. On the role of multilaterals like IFAD, I think it's important that we continue providing concessional finance, that the type of interest rate that we're applying are very concessional, as well as grants. But it needs to go beyond that. The institutions like ourselves or the World Bank or the African Development Bank, Casa Depositi, we need to also provide the incentives to mobilize the private sector. For us, in particular at IFA, this has meant that for the first time we will be using our own money, our own balance sheet, to co-invest with the private sector. It's not enough to do public-private partnerships. We need to be able to provide the guarantees or to co-invest with the private sector. And this means that all institutions, including ourselves, need to continue evolving. In terms of also another important area, I would say it's climate adaptation for us. Many of the small-scale farmers, you can see it here in Italy, in my home country, in Spain, but everywhere in the world, they're suffering from droughts, from floods, from extreme heat, and that has changed the way that food is being produced. So it's important that we also try to mobilize further financing, because it's not only about the production, it's also about the sustainability of many of these investments. And whether we want it or not, nowadays we are suffering of a lot of extreme weather events, and this needs to be taken into consideration. The Italian Climate Fund, mentioned by the Vice Minister, is one of the avenues that we would be very keen to continue pursuing. We have a strong relationship also with Casa Depositi, with the public development banks in Africa, also with the private banks. We have also a number of programs in Africa. So I think it's important that there's a number of different stakeholders, not only the public sector, but also the private banks, the public development banks, the local private sector, not only the multinationals, that we need to continue making sure that they are connected. For us, that's going to be one of the priorities. And then finally, in the topic that also the Vice Minister mentioned, and what I think is important, it's clear that we are back to a debt crisis. Many of the governments, and specifically in Africa, are not able to fund many of their priorities. For example, Ethiopia spends $26 per capita in terms of debt, whereas they spend $8 per capita on health or education, which clearly you can see already where the investments are going. So there could be potential solutions. Some countries are working on it, on potential debt swaps for food security, debt swaps for energy, for climate, for other matters.
Prova canale inglese, prova.
Countries in Africa need also to have the fiscal space to co-invest. And after the post-Malabo declaration,
prova canale inglese, 1, 2, 3.
And we would be very keen to continue partnering with Africa in terms of how to mobilize further financing from the public sector, but also from the private sector.
It's clear that private investment are a fundamental element of the Mattei Plan and this conversation. Mr. Adarad, what can governments and international financial institutions do to improve this effort? And what tools or mechanisms can support these initiatives in the private sector investment?
Yeah, and I think that's a global trend. I think the private sector role in economic, whether it's revival or an economic expansion as far as growth is a key component. However, in markets such as in Africa, sometimes there's some ambiguity between private and public sector, meaning that the role of the private sector sometimes becomes monopolized in a way to where it starts to behave like public sector. So this is one of the important things, is that when we talk about private sector, we have to clearly define what we're talking about. And then it's a very, clear-cut definition when it comes to the ownership. Is it a publicly owned or privately owned? This is clear. However, when it comes to the actual decision-making process, prioritization of investments, access to markets, things like that, if you start to monopolize that, then you're basically just moving the problem from one area to the other. You haven't really solved the issue there. So I think that's the first thing, is there has to be, challenging and pushing back on what I would call the illegitimate private sector. So this is the first thing. The second thing is, again, to the point I was making earlier about confidence, reestablishing confidence in these markets. So providing the financial mechanism, whether it's through bank guarantees or letters of credit or some other form of established financial vehicles that provide the financial guarantees for these investments in case things don't necessarily go as smoothly as they can. And also primarily for small, medium business, where agriculture is primarily dominated in the sort of that end of the value chain, mainly by small or medium-sized farmers. However, you've got conglomerates and multinational companies that are taking these products and turning them into profits. So that linkage has to be, in the private sector, has to make sense from an investment standpoint, and there's got to be some kind of synergy between the raw material and the products that are being produced and the markets you're targeting. You cannot sort of put a square peg into a round hole. There has to be a logical fit. And this comes back to the role of private sector. These assessments, market knowledge, understanding what is the needs, has to be from people who are in the market, who understand that market or connected to those communities. And then the other point is with regards to the issue of corruption. These markets, a lot of times, they're hindered by deep-rooted corruption. And that's why a lot of private investors are hesitant and even, sometimes the victims of a lot of this, or sometimes they are contributors to the problem. Okay, this is also a common theme. So I think from a private sector standpoint, if I'm not getting my money back, if I'm not getting a profit out of my investment, I'm less likely to take the risk. So this, again, has to be utilized in order to combat that level of corruption. In my opinion, the two biggest enemies to corruption are technology and the private sector, a properly structured private sector. And this is, again, coming back to the first point about confidence. When you've got those two elements in place, the technology can provide you transparency, more efficient processes, visibility to what's going on between the different partners involved in the supply chain. Just one simple example when it comes to the one window systems with regards to customs and importation and exportation processes. That kind of system is absent in most of the African markets. I think there's very few markets that actually utilize that. Implementation of such systems where you've got some efficiencies in the supply chain and the distribution and cargo shipments goes far beyond just bilateral trade agreements and just free trade zones and the traditional structure that companies are used to operating. This gives a platform for visibility about where everything is moving, where all the products going. One other issue with regards to this is coming back to the enhancement of the quality of life. Okay, I think this is something where the workforce you're going to be relying on when you make these investments, these are people who are impacted by the poverty and some of the negative impact of the current situation in some of these regions. In order for you to sell the concept that there is some benefit for these communities that you want to invest in, they have to be involved at some level in the supply chain, not just a matter of you get a job at some low-level pay and then it's better than zero. It's better than having to take the risk of life to cut across the Mediterranean for a better life. But at the same time, it doesn't have to mean that you have to stay on that poverty line. There has to be some level of ambition towards prosperity, to move away from this poverty and this quality of life. There should not be this culture of accepting the status quo or some level of quality of life that from a corporate standpoint is seen as a benefit, but from a community standpoint is definitely just continuing to fuel the problem of low quality of life, which is feeding a lot of these forced migrations that was mentioned, etc. And the instability, whether it's war or any other form of instability. The trade corridors across the globe are becoming challenging, whether it's the Suez Canal or any other trade corridors that we are seeing today. That's why we're seeing a competition to build new corridors, because of the instability of the existing corridors. However, the growth factor from a private sector standpoint is heavily reliant on a sustainable, stable supply chain and a trade corridor. So this is where I think the private sector has a lot of interest in investing and building these corridors in order to provide the infrastructure for these investments, whether it's the Matei Plan or any other type of initiative. And I think this is where you close the circle and come back to the profitability, the sustainability, and the credibility of these kinds of initiatives for the long run, and not just sort of the wow factor of, you know, a 4 or 5 year honeymoon period, and then you're back to square one. And this is where I think the focus needs to be, and the key metric that needs to be identified and measured going forward.
We have less than a couple of minutes. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah, perhaps one just 2 thoughts for the audience. I mean, every year we have 7, 8, 10 million of young Africans coming into the job market. In the continent, we have at the same time around 80 billion, which has been increasing over the last decade in terms of food imports. Imagine the type of jobs if they were transformed and created in the continent in terms of the transformation and the raw materials and the value added, where it's in logistics, in the distribution, in the manufacturing, how many jobs we could create there, and what would that mean for the global, I mean, it's stability, but also for the global food security. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, just to add on to that, I think all of the other, the stability that everybody's striving for, including in my home country in Libya, in my opinion, is primarily linked to the economic prosperity. If we start to revive the economic wheel and we start turning the discussions away from the guns and the fights and the border disagreements, etc., into contracts and projects and investments, and the competition shifts from these armed battles into more healthy competitive battles, if you want to call it that, I think this is really the ultimate goal here. Again, to improve the quality of life and providing a dignified life to people who are in this region. I think that's really the game changer here.
Okay, we must end this session here. Thank you very much. It
Thank
was
you.
a pleasure to listen to you, and thank you for you all.
Thank you.